international and European law student, and also the editor-in-chief of the ILSA journal. On one side of the screen, you can see my colleague and co-ILSA member, Jackie, and on the other side, you can see Mr. Omar Dweik, the author of Peace to Unity, a framework for peace between Palestine and Israel, written by him. We're very honored to have here today. Mr. Dweik is an MA student in International Relations at Queen's University Belfast, with a BA in International and European Law at the Hague University of Applied Sciences. Also, he's a postgraduate certificate in International and Strategic Affairs at the Institute for International and Strategic Affairs in Paris. So, today's event is entirely dedicated to his work, which consists of a unique attempt to provide a myriad of insightful and out-of-the-box solutions to the long-standing conflict between the two states. His research revolves around the question whether a confederation between Palestine and Israel, on the basis of the previous and the present peace proposition, is possible. And that is what we are basically discussing today. But first things first, let me present to you the agenda for today. Firstly, Mr. Dweik will give you a presentation on his book. Secondly, we will open a discussion based on the questions that the ILSA Journal Committee has prepared. And lastly, we will jump straight into the Q&A. We encourage you to put your questions in the chat, but we encourage you even more, and we would really appreciate if you would raise your hand and unmute your mic. After all, we want to have a constructive discussion, so it would be really nice if everyone participated. Now, without further ado, I will give the floor to Mr. Dweik. Mr. Dweik, the floor is yours.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank the organizers very much for this event and ILSA in general. I also obviously would like to thank all the viewers here that are attending this. It's really appreciated, and I'm very happy with your interest in the book. I would also like to say that I'm much more accustomed to be on your side of the screen rather than my side of the screen, so please bear with me on that. But yeah, without further ado, I think it's good to start a little bit with my background because it was instrumental in how we got towards the book. So I was born to a Dutch mother and a Palestinian father in France. And shortly after, we moved to Jerusalem, where I resided for 8 years. Then, during the height of the second uprising, around 2001, we moved to the Netherlands to flee the violence, and here I continued to pursue my studies, as they've already indicated, firstly at HHS, and then in Paris, and lastly I ended up in Queen's University in Belfast, where I'm now in the very final stages of my master studies. The book actually started as a research instead of an internship in 2020. In 2020, the COVID outbreak was really new, and organizations, companies were still not accustomed to how to deal with that. So internship opportunities and work opportunities were very limited at the time, yet some form of internship or work experience was mandatory for my studies in Paris. So we came up with the idea to propose an independent research which was conducted for a human rights organization based here in the Netherlands. And the idea was to basically research whether the Trump peace agreement, which came out in early 2020, could be transformed into something which would be able to achieve Palestinian rights. Now, the quick answer to that was no. The agreement was so heavily skewed towards what Israel wanted that it was relatively inconceivable that it could be used to as a basis for a peace agreement between Palestine and Israel. So instead, the research turned into a counter proposition in the sense of, could we, under a confederate structure, by taking some elements from the Trump peace agreement, establish a framework which could bring peace between Palestine and Israel? And that's how the book, or like what now is a book, but the report developed further and further and further into a substantial amount of text. And ultimately, it was published by a Swedish publisher which specializes in research on peace and conflict studies. So, that being said, the content of the book. So, the core idea behind it was to propose a sort of EU-like structure. The idea was that, in essence, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is a territorial dispute. It revolves around which territory belongs to which population group, with the major issue that both population groups see the territory between what you'd call the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, or what is now the occupied Palestinian territories in Israel, as their entire territory. So what then the problem is if you completely separate the two states, you have very conflicting points of view, and all the negotiations on every centimeter of land ceded becomes very complicated. So the idea was, could we politically separate the two groups, whereas allowing them to fulfill their dream of living on the entirety of the territory? So the core vector behind the book is actually based on residency rights detached from the territorial principle, which is somewhat contradictory towards the state system, but it does allow, for instance, Israeli settlers that live in Palestinian territory to vote and partake in Israeli parliamentary elections, for instance, or in the Israeli political system in general, while maintaining or remaining citizens in Palestine. And on the other hand, Palestinians who wish to work and live in Israel, or are already working and living there, would not need to be uprooted, and their rights would be guaranteed, their political rights would be guaranteed, because they would be able to partake in Palestinian elections and in Palestinian political process. So the advantage of this is that Palestine has a very symbolic claim, which is referred to as the 1967 borders. The 1967 borders was actually the stalemate after the 1967 war, and it constituted 22% of the entire territory where Palestinians used to live on under the British mandate. And so it is a testament of the heartland of what Palestinians used to live on, but also it is sort of the minimum territory that the Palestinians could accept. So under this construction, Palestine could be recognized on the basis of these borders, because the settlers that live in those territories, within those territories, about 700,000 of them, would not need to be uprooted. And uprooting the settlements would be very, very unpopular in Israel, if not, some have hypothesized, a prelude to a civil war, because forcible transfer of 700,000, or roughly 10% of your population, is actually a substantial problem. So the idea behind it was to establish this framework which sort of works with the situation on the ground rather than against it. Now, whereas these residency rights and this construction could allow for the border claims to be resolved, one major issue which unfortunately we have seen flare up in recent weeks is the issue of Jerusalem. There is a saying that goes, wars get fought over Jerusalem, and we have seen the effects of that in the recent weeks. And so any fair peace agreement must involve some sort of satisfactory resolution on Jerusalem for both sides. The issue with that, however, is that the claims to Jerusalem between Palestinians and Israelis are diametrically opposed, with Israel claiming the entirety of Jerusalem, the eastern and the western part of it, as their undivided capital, whereas the Palestinians have agreed to only having their capital in East Jerusalem and allowing Israel to establish their capital in West Jerusalem, which is then rejected by the Israelis, and they counter-offered that the capital of Palestine would be established in a suburb of Jerusalem in what is roughly similar to Rijswijk to The Hague, which is wholly unacceptable to the Palestinians. So to find a solution on this is very complicated, especially if you have a two-state model, because that would mean that you need to separate the city, and nobody really wants to see a return of barricades and a return of walls and a physical separation of the city. So my proposition actually is that Jerusalem would be the capital of the Confederation as a whole, and the parties are strongly invited to recognize it as each other's capital. However, that is not necessary, because we've seen in the Austro-Hungarian Empire that there was no official capital. There were two de facto capitals in Budapest and Vienna. So that, in essence, is possible under international law. And then the way that I proposed it to be governed is through sort of a prefectural system, somewhat similar to France and Japan, where you have an emissary, or how do you call it, an envoy by each government, which is tasked with the day-to-day governance of these separate ethnic neighborhoods. So what you would see is you would have chunks of Jerusalem which are governed by two separate government systems, but with some homogenized laws, which I would not go into too much detail because of time constraints. The only exception to that prefectural system would be the old town of Jerusalem, because that's where all the very historic sites and religious sites are located. Some estimates have it around 200 religious sites, but the high estimates go into the 1,000 significant religious sites on 2 square kilometers, which means that it's a tiny, tiny territory with enormous significance. So to accommodate the claims of both sides, I propose that the Confederation would appoint a governor for the old city of Jerusalem, and that governor would be supported by a religious council with a Jewish, a Christian, and a Muslim representative to ensure that no sensitive breaches of religion are occurring. And so in that way, you establish a system which, to my mind, and also which the University of Windsor in Canada has found, could be satisfactory to both sides, because there's an open city which doesn't need a radical change from how it is governed today, whereas the symbolic claims to the city would be met. So, that being said, I would like to move on to the third very important topic which needs to be resolved, which is the one of security. Now, security has been there's a plethora of information available on Israeli and Palestinian security questions. So there's no need to go into intricate details about it, because if you want to find resources about it, they're abundantly available. What I do want to go into is how my proposition differs, how a confederate structure sort of allows for a greater, more robust security framework. Because what I proposed was that the Confederacy would have one department which deals with security matters, and is somewhat similar to NATO's command and control structure, where you have different representatives coming together and then jointly deciding on military missions. And I also proposed that on the long term, there would be a joint Palestinian-Israeli force, which are highly capable of addressing issues as terrorism, conducting intelligence, and like matters, and then report it back to the Joint Command Center. And to make it acceptable for both sides, I propose that there will be an equal amount of Palestinians and Israelis in that council, supported by either a US or a NATO representative to break the deadlock in case needed. In parallel to that, Palestine will be demilitarized. That has been a concession that Palestine has agreed to make a long time ago, so there's no need to spend too much time on that. But Israel would be allowed to maintain its military, providing that it does not use it for any incursions into Palestine without the consent of Palestine and without the Confederation. So that allows Israel to, if push comes to shove, and if there is a dire situation where, for instance, an army marches through Palestine going towards Israel, the joint interest of the Confederation would be to use the Israeli army to repel that force. So there's this extra layer of protection which could be accorded to Israel, whereas at the same time, it is subject to Palestinian consent. So it also guarantees Palestinian sovereignty, while it also addresses the issue that the Palestinians are mortally afraid of the fact that Israel might reoccupy them. So in that structure, I think Israel would actually have an expansion of their security guarantees. I think that it's a more robust framework. And above all, it just takes the argument away from hostile countries to attack Israel on the basis that it occupies Palestine. So there are a bunch of guarantees which are implicit to such a structure, which I think would be beneficial to Palestinians and Israelis. Now, I have seen the questions with which ILSA have prepared for me, so I don't want to go into too much detail about Gaza and Hamas at this moment. But what I do want to talk about is some statistics which back up, in essence, why we must really think about a confederate structure for Palestine and Israel, and why more research is needed on both the international law and international relations side on what possible structures there are. The first statistic is that 40% of Haredi and ultra-Orthodox Jews, which are typically seen as the more extreme segment of the Israeli population, are in favor of a confederacy, whereas only 17% are in fact in favor of a two-state solution where Palestine and Israel are separated by hard borders. So, and this is a very important statistic because ultra-Orthodox and Haredi Jews have privileged positions within the Israeli political system and have for the last, at least under the Benjamin Netanyahu coalitions, formed the backbone of the government and have been, in general, the decisive vote in these coalitions. So you can't really go around them. You have to address, at least in part, their desires. And they're vehemently opposed to the establishment of Palestinian states. In fact, 17% of them supports a two-state solution, and 27% supports the expulsion of the Palestinians from all of the territory. So for these groups, expelling the Palestinians is actually more beneficial, or at least in their point of view, than a two-state solution. But, as I just said, 40% of them would be okay with a confederate structure. So that is that is an important statistic to keep in mind. On the Palestinian side, 57% of the Gazans have voiced their preference for a confederate structure, which largely trumped the statistics for a two-state solution. This, however, does not follow the entire Palestinian population who slightly edged or lean towards the two-state solution. But we need to take into account that this support has been eroding very quickly over the last decade, with alternative solutions like a confederacy gaining in popularity. In fact, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the solution which they preferred was actually, or like which is gaining in popularity the quickest, is a one-state solution, which is wholly unacceptable to the Israelis. But it goes to show that, in fact, both populations are actually moving towards a tendency of a confederate structure rather than a two-state solution. And in that sense, I'm part of that trend. And I also think that, in general, the developments in the world have proven that we are moving towards less and less strict border restrictions and more international cooperation. So I also would see a two-state solution as a step backwards from the developments of the last 30-odd years or so. So I would like to conclude my introductory section with those statistics. I think that it's important to keep those in mind for the questions that are coming next. So the floor is to ILSA again.
Yes, thank you, Omar, for the wonderful presentation. That was quite clear. Now I will give the floor to Jackie. He will entertain some general questions, and then we will delve into more specific questions. So, Jackie, the floor is yours.
So yesterday evening, it has been confirmed there is a new Israeli government without Netanyahu, the first government formed without him in 12 years. And this new government is supported by a quite peculiar coalition, which gathers very different parties, ranging from the far right to the Arab Islamist Party. And do you have any hopes in this new government to engage in peace talks with Palestinians?
I would actually be surprised if this government would get anything done, let alone conducting peace talks with the Palestinians. This coalition has been dubbed in Israeli media as the change government, but I think it would be more accurate to describe them as an ousting committee of Benjamin Netanyahu rather than, in fact, a coalition. I think that the Palestinians will definitely not shed a tear that Netanyahu is going to be is gone, at least for now. But I don't think that they will be rejoicing by any means that the new prime minister is Naftali Bennett. Naftali Bennett comes from the right-wing section of the former political party of Benjamin Netanyahu. He was an extremist within the Likud party of Benjamin Netanyahu, and he has actually actively boasted that he killed a large amount of Arabs, and stated that there is no problem with that. So there is no reason to believe that this prime minister in the form of Naftali Bennett is actually in any way dedicated to a peace process. In fact, he has voiced his opinion that he wants to annex the vast majority of the West Bank, if not all of the West Bank, and just relegate Palestinians to second-class citizens without voting rights. That is his endgame. So in that sense, there is no real chance that there will be any negotiations for peace. Now, it's not all grim. Netanyahu is gone. That is a positive part. What's also a positive part is it is the first time in history, as you correctly pointed out, that an Arab Islamist party acceded to a government in Israel. And it's also the party which the coalition depends on to maintain their majority in the Israeli parliament. So that is definitely a development. What's more is Yair Lapid, who is a centrist and who has voiced his a favorable position towards resuming peace talks with the Palestinians. He has played an instrumental role in bringing together this coalition, and he has played an instrumental role, and he is going to be the prime minister for the second cycle. Now, both Yair Lapid and Naftali Bennett will hold a veto over each other's policies. So, in any case, that political system is stuck. But what I do find very positive signs is that after the recent round of fighting of a couple of weeks ago, we actually saw the most recent polls like a couple of hours ago coming out, which found that left-wing parties actually rose in popularity. So that points that at least the Israeli population does not see very heavy security measures, at least in this round of fighting, as preferential. In fact, you see a trend towards more the peace camp. So there are a lot of factors that are moving in Israel, which indicate that there are some sort of steps towards a more lenient position towards the Palestinians. But at this moment, I cannot see the Israeli parliament or the Israeli coalition take any steps towards peace. I think that we will see a continuation of the previous politics. I don't think that there's going to be any radical change on the position of Palestine. I cannot see Palestine, the West Bank, being formally annexed by the Israelis as Naftali Bennett wants it to be, because Yair Lapid will veto that. But on the other hand, I don't see a resumption of negotiations with the Palestinians. And then there's the last element to it, which is this coalition is probably not going to survive even that long that we're going to get to a point that we're going to have negotiations anyway. The moment that Benjamin Netanyahu leaves the political spectrum, the whole purpose of this coalition is going to fall apart. The only common goal which keeps this diverse group of political parties together is going to fall apart. And I believe that with that, the whole coalition will collapse. So the way that I see it, if I may speculate, is that Netanyahu is put aside. He's going to face criminal charges. Most likely he's going to get indicted and punished for those. He's going to leave the political spectrum, and in that process, the whole coalition will fall apart, and then we have renewed elections. I think that that is the most realistic way that it's going to move forward.
But now the new government has a very raised a thin support among the Knesset, so Israel's parliament, with one seat in the majority, like 60 out of 120. So yeah. They rely on all of the parties forming that coalition, including the Arab Islamist Party. Hence, do you think that their presence in the new government would, instead of supporting negotiations towards a peace, would there instead be a decrease of tensions?
That's a really good question. It is also difficult question to answer because we have to project what we know now on the future. I would like to point out that it is historic that an Islamist Palestinian party is in a coalition. Palestinian or like Arab Israeli parties, as the correct term so allows, have been active in Israeli politics for quite a while. The thing is, I think that it sort of broke down the taboo of working with the Palestinian factions. They have largely been marginalized. They've largely been treated as anomalies in the Israeli political spectrum, and they have been just ignored in political spectrum. Now we have a substantial voice in the Knesset, a very strong voice. And I think if Mansour Abbas, the leader of Ram, would take his position seriously, it's a very clear signal to Israelis, look, pragmatism can prevail. Cooperation can prevail. We're the example of that. Whether that's going to happen wholly depends on how this coalition works. If this coalition is going to bicker and fight, I could very well see that we're gonna have a step back where our political parties are going to get shoved to the side. But I think that this is a very interesting development, which is certainly not going to go away soon. So the answer of this is a bit inconclusive. It just sort of depends on how this coalition plays out. But I think it's a historical development nonetheless. It shows that Palestinians and Israelis can politically cooperate. And that is, to my mind, the first time in history that we've seen that.
Yeah, it is indeed an improvement in the situation. But also ask another question, rather general, on the situation in Israel and Palestine. Do you think that a mediator like the US and Egypt did in the past would be necessary, like to conduct negotiations or at least international relations between Israel and Palestine?
Absolutely. I don't think that without a mediator this could happen. The question is, who should mediate? Egypt, let me start off with Egypt because that would be the easier one to answer. Egypt is an Arab country with a substantial portion of the population which supports the Arab cause. Now, they're one of the more moderate countries with diplomatic relations with Israel. But you have to see it from a geopolitical perspective as well as a strength perspective. In Egypt, which exceeds as a mediator to the negotiations, would mean that it would elevate Palestinian bargaining power. It would improve the Palestinian negotiation strength because they have another country which is somewhat in their camp. Similarly, the US previously, and now we get into the more complicated one, previously it was unthinkable that any negotiation would take place without the US. The US was the privileged partner by far and beyond, without a doubt, to negotiate between the Israelis and Palestinians. Now, the Palestinians have always been suspicious about the US position, to say it in rather friendly terms. But since Trump recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital, since he recognized the Golan Heights as being Israeli sovereignty, and by endorsing Israeli settlement construction, he has severely damaged the relationship with Palestine up to a point where the Palestinians no longer trust the US. So the question then arises, could you exclude the US from negotiations? I think the very simple answer is no. They have too much power in the Middle East. And this brings us back to how previous negotiations were constructed, which was the so-called Quartet, in which the US, the UN, the European Union, and Russia all were sitting at a negotiation table as mediators and working together to try to bring about peace. And the importance of having such a diverse group of countries is that you sort of try to equate, you try to get Palestine to the same level as Israel, because Israel is by far and beyond militarily, diplomatically, and in terms of power superior to Palestine in a way that it's not even remotely a fair fight and remotely a fair negotiation. One-on-one negotiations will be essentially a parent sort of negotiating the allowance of their child, which the child has literally no say of, and the parent could decide in any case what the allowance is going to be at any point. So the importance of mediators is to sort of try to balance that out, try to get the Palestinians and Israelis on the same level. And the game on the Israeli side is to maintain your position of power to get more concessions at the other side. So I cannot see Egypt being added to negotiation table apart from being an observer. I would suggest that Russia, the EU, the US, and the UN are going to remain the privileged partners for negotiations, with perhaps one notable exception which might also be added to the observer status, which would be Saudi Arabia, because they play an enormously important role behind the scenes and have an incredible financial power over the Palestinian Authority in particular. So I would think that maybe including Saudi Arabia to the negotiation table would allow some sort of extra benefits to Israel from Arab countries, which might help the negotiations, but that is speculative, and I think that the main partners are going to be the traditional Quartet ones to answer that question.
Thank you very much for your answer. Now maybe moving to the book more precisely, like to your work. Maybe David has questions in that regard.
Yes, since we're speaking about third parties, reading through your book, and there's a section where you address the role of Iran into the matter. So you rightly say that Iran sees itself as a Muslim leader country in the Middle East, and of course it will do everything to protect this image. Now the thing is, what if, let's say, this solution is implemented, it goes smooth between Israel and Palestine? What if Iran, let's say, continues to oppose this peaceful solution? So you have to say that Iran actually has a really strong role in this. It's financing plenty of organizations and terrorists, which actually have a strong grip on in Palestinian territories and in the Middle East generally. What's your take on this? If Iran continues to use this influence, and regardless of this weak economic position that might result from the sanctions that Iran is being under with, let's say if they raise more money by engaging into the black markets, which is something that is currently happening right now. Plenty of these countries are getting into the drug markets and everything. So the money is not a problem over here. The problem is the ideology. What's your take on this? How do you think this can be approached?
There's a lot to unpack in that question. Let me start off by saying that the Iranian economy is actually a lot more stable than we think it is. In the sense that, okay, they have been under sanctions and the sanctions have taken their toll, but they have a very diversified economy which has a substantial services sector, a financing sector which is very strong, a very strong agricultural sector, and oil and natural resources sales are only part of that. So Iran definitely has some money to spend in that regard. The question then is, to what extent does Iran actually have an influence over this? If you follow the Israeli narrative, which I described in my book but disagree with, then Israel is the main party behind the scenes which could torpedo and derail any peace agreement between Palestine and Israel. That's the Israeli point of view. I sincerely doubt whether they actually have that control. Not to say that I actually disagree with that. Starting off with, to what extent does Iran actually control Hamas? I think that there are some very strong indicators that Hamas is in fact an independent entity from Iran, but enjoys its support out of a conflation of interests. So one of the most clear examples of that is the stance of Iran and the stance of Hamas on the Syrian civil war. Hamas openly voiced support for the rebels. And we know that Iran is a staunch supporter of the Assad regime. And so over that rift, Iran has stopped financing Hamas for a brief period of time. They mended relations, and certainly that has in some ways affected Hamas's capabilities, but it has not seen a collapse of the organization. We have seen in the recent round of fighting that they have a substantial arsenal, that they have multiple sources of income. So I do not think that Iran would actually be capable of derailing that. And then the second question is it actually preferential for Iran to do that? Obviously, Iran has geopolitical rivalries with Israel. That's no doubt about it. But at the same time, Iran pushes forth a narrative that it has issues with Israel primarily because it occupies Palestine. And it would be very difficult, to my mind at least, for Iran to maintain that line of reasoning if Palestine signs a peace agreement with Israel, and God forbid for Iran if Hamas accedes to that. If that's the case, then I cannot see Iran having a very strong argument to say we're going to protect the Palestinian cause, because it will be resolved. What I could see happening, however, is that Iran might try to finance some radical groups to try to weaken Israel and the Confederation in general. But that would mostly be a nuisance rather than any detrimental factor. And most of all, Iran has already opposed the Oslo Accords. It was a very vocal opponent of it when it got signed in 1993. Nonetheless, it got signed and it went through. So that means that Iran does not have the power to block any peace agreement. But it can, to a limited extent, sort of try to weaken Israel. On that topic, I would also like to add that militarily, Israel is stronger. Diplomatically, Israel is stronger. So we don't see Iran bomb Israeli targets, at least not frequently, if any. We see that it's happening the other way around. We see that Israel is targeting Iranian targets in Syria, in Lebanon, and it's very actively engaged in a sabotage campaign for the Iranian nuclear program. So what we're seeing is actually that there's a lot more meddling from the Israeli perspective in Iran's affairs than the other way around. Whether that is so because Iran has limited capabilities, I mean, undoubtedly Iran would have a better response to it. But the truth of the matter is, the reality is that they cannot. So bottom line, like, getting Iran on board would be definitely preferential. Not getting them on board is going to be far from a catastrophe, to my mind. So I hope that very long answer responds to your question.
It actually does. To be honest, like according to my opinion, it wouldn't be beneficial to Iran to do that, and that's why I try to focus it more on the ideological part. That these countries who are strongly guided by religious principles have. That's what I wanted to focus. And let's say, in a good case scenario, that Iran does not decide to put into jeopardy all these projects. What if, let's say, Hamas do not take this route, which I'm sure that they will not be very in agreement with this solution? How do we address this case? I mean, in your book, you mentioned something about demilitarization and all that process. But how easy is that put into practice?
I doubt whether Hamas doesn't have an interest to accede to a peace agreement. I sincerely doubt that. There is kind of a misunderstanding about Hamas, which is painted in the West as an irrational, radical fighting force which seeks the destruction of Israel. Whether that latter part is correct or not, it doesn't really matter, because in any case, they don't have the capabilities to it. So they could jump high and low whatever they want, but it's not going to happen. The thing is that Hamas is not at all ruled by a group of radical lunatics. In fact, the leadership of Hamas are rather strategic and pragmatic. For instance, they have openly, Khaled Mishal, the former spokesperson of Hamas, has openly stated that they are facing a formidable army which they cannot defeat. He has said that on public television. They're not delusional about it. Now, when you hear like that Hamas is seeking the destruction of Israel or seeking to establish a Palestinian state on the historic mandate for Palestine, I would think that it's more rhetorical. It's more a principle standpoint. It's more to say like this used to be ours and now it has shrunk to this. But what they have included in the recent iteration of their charter is the addition that if the Palestinian people decide on a peace agreement, that Hamas would not stand in that way. So in that sense, they have implicitly recognized that even though they might disagree with the peace agreement, they will accept it for the sake of the Palestinians. Now, let us say these are all lies. They might choose to oppose it. I think that, firstly, that would be political suicide for Hamas. I think that they would lose a whole lot of support from the Palestinians, especially those living in Gaza. I think that they would have a very hard time getting financial backers, except probably from a handful of states like Iran. But removing them from Gaza would be very difficult. I think that you would have to establish, as I described in my book, a carrot and a stick policy. You would need to open a space, and it will be a catastrophic mistake not to include Hamas in any form or matter in peace negotiations. I would say that they need to have a space where they would be allowed to continue their political activities while encouraging them to gradually disarm themselves. And I think that there will be, from my estimations at least, a substantial interest from Hamas to do that. Undoubtedly, there are going to be splinter groups that are not going to do that, and these processes take a long time. But in many situations, like you've seen in the rebels in Northern Ireland, as you have seen in certain parts in disarmament missions in Africa, oftentimes these militant groups are complacent or are willing to give up their arms for political gains. But I think that the pressure on Hamas will be enormous if there is a peace agreement which is acceptable to the Palestinians to reject it. I think that they would have to face significant pressure from the Palestinian population in Gaza to maintain that line. So I don't think that there is a whole lot of room for Hamas to oppose any such agreement. So in a nutshell, probably they might be able to maintain their line of reasoning for a couple of years at most, but ultimately it will be political suicide for them. So I don't think that Hamas is stupid enough, and actually I'm fairly confident that they're pragmatic and strategic enough not to try to oppose a peace agreement. However, they might derail the process. That is something which I think is a much more realistic thing that they'll try to do. But once an agreement is signed, I don't think that they'll oppose it. And I think that Israel is using this argument, which I think is based on a false assumption, to delay talks, to not have a peace agreement. They're pushing the narrative, saying, even if we sign a peace agreement, Hamas is going to reject it. I think that that plays in the hands of Israel. I think that it's an incorrect assumption. And I think that Hamas will accede to a solution in case the Palestinian people accept it.
Well, that's I'm trying to be as I'm trying to be as much objective in this case. So I'm an outsider. I really have never lived or actually been in the region. So I don't see how the clear picture is Of course, we live in times where disinformation is quite a problem, and we never get to see the clear picture of how reality works. But we know for something that I want to focus is the relation between the Palestinian people and the Hamas. So what you rightly said, of course, the Hamas will think in the interest of the Palestinians. But I'm a bit skeptical about the control that the Palestinian people could actually have on Hamas, because it is seen that since the Hamas came into power, votings haven't been held since. So what kind of a representation are we talking about here?
Well, the last element, which you just said, is not Hamas's fault. It's the Palestinian Liberation Organization and the Palestinian Authority's fault, which is led by the main rival of Hamas, which is the Fatah party. Fatah has won the presidential elections back in 2006, and since they have been just postponing the elections indefinitely. On the other hand, Hamas has been elected in 2007, or elected. They have won the majority in the parliament, which got denied by Fatah. So, in fact, Hamas came to power through a democratic process. Now, why? The question which we need to ask: why did they come to power in the first place? And to my mind, it's because they ran a very effective campaign in which they said, "We're not our corrupt counterparts." Essentially, that was their entire message during the election campaign, and what we see is it worked really well. So back in the day, Hamas won. They had a substantial support base, but they won principally because Fatah was so incredibly corrupt. And what we have seen is it for good reason. The PA is very corrupt, and PA has evaded elections, and so in that sense, I think that Hamas will actually at this moment be pushing for elections, because I think that they will win, and I think that they think that they'll win. On the other hand, the reason why Hamas has such a substantial support base is because they have not rejected armed struggle. And so a lot of Palestinians consider it as their rightful, their right to resist the occupation by any means necessary, because they have tried to negotiate with no results. They have appealed to the international community without results. So a lot of Palestinians have the mentality of, look, we tried everything. We're now forced to take up arms. You have left us no choice but to do that. And Hamas is playing very well into that narrative. The occupation is only an entrenchment of that mentality. It only serves for the Palestinians to think that they need to defend themselves militarily, because there's no other way possible. That said, that whole mentality will just fall apart. It will crumble once the peace agreement is signed, and especially if Israel truly sticks to it and retreats from the Palestinian territories. And traditionally, the Palestinians are a very moderate country in terms of their Islamic beliefs, because they're highly educated. The Palestinians have been under British rule, so traditionally they're a lot less extreme in their ideological thoughts than other countries in the region. So even the Islamist agenda, which might appeal to a segment of the population, will not hold true after the whole purpose of armed struggle falls away. So what you're seeing right now is a support for Hamas, a self-perpetuating cycle. Israel denies, Israel occupies Palestine, which gives rise to support to armed struggle. And then this armed struggle sees Israel clamping down harder on Palestine for the occupation. But I think it is unfair to to say about Hamas that they are the undemocratic part, because they have the ones that kept their end of the bargain, so to speak, and they have been violently overthrown by the Palestinian Liberation Organization, more specifically Fatah, with support of the West. So we don't have any indication that they are opposed to democracy, at least not a real life one, because they have never been in a position to allow that to happen. Hamas has always been the secondary party to the Palestinian political playing field. Hamas has offered multiple times to the Palestinian Liberation Organization to hold elections, which have been interfered with by Israel, has been interfered with by Europe and by the US, out of fear that they might actually win the elections. So there is no real way of telling whether Hamas is actually going to adhere to a political system or not. We never gave them the opportunity to do so, quite simply said. So I hope that that sort of answers your question, because it's just open to interpretation, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. No, it's this is, of course, this is a hypothetical scenario, which I try to be positive. I really would love to see how this would play out. I mean, of course, it's much beneficial for both parties to actually sit down and have proper negotiations where both parties hold the ends of the bargain. That usually, most of the time, it goes well if that sort of strategy is followed, depending on how much. Yeah, of course, there are plenty of factors of that, but normally it plays out at least in the Western civilization when both parties try to adhere to their obligations. Most of the time, it's a positive outcome. But let me not try to be too general. Of course, now I see that in timing we're doing well. I will give the floor back to Jackie one more time. You can ask one or two questions, but it would be good if at 7:40 we started with the Q&A from the guests.
Yeah, I agree. Can I also interject for a second? I would suggest, because we're at the halfway point here, to just have a short 5 minutes break for those who need to replenish their water, and then come back, and then we can address these questions. I would suggest it that way.
Yeah, we can do that.
All right,
So
I'll see you
let's
in
be
5.
back in 5 minutes.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay, shall we start again?
Yep, absolutely.
All right, Jackie, you can go on with your question, and meanwhile, I will post some details. I've already put the name of the book in the chat, so people can look it up and see it. And I'll also put some of your contact details, so people can contact you if they have any questions afterward.
Yeah, that would be great.
Perfect.
Thank
All right,
you.
we can continue.
Yeah. So I would like to go back to the details of your book, Peace to Unity.
Yeah.
As a possible solution, you propose a confederation where Israel and Palestine would retain their sovereign powers as states. But is Israel really open to recognize Palestine as a state?
That's an interesting one. I think the very short and quick answer is no. But there are a whole lot of things which come with that. So, ideally, Israel, from what we know, what their politicians have said is they would like to maintain the current situation, which is absolutely unacceptable to the Palestinians, obviously. So, elevating the Palestinian status to a state, or at least recognizing it as a state, and having the UN recognize it as a state, that would pose a whole lot of restrictions on what Israel could do with what is now Palestine. We see through their actions that they are actually doing whatever they can to halt Palestinian statehood. It's not a secret. They have said it in reports. They have written it in communiques, etc. The issue with it is it a sustainable sort of point of view? Is it sustainable to go through the way that they are right now? And I think that almost nobody on the planet, including the Israelis, would say that it is. So, whether they want it or not, at one point, I think they will have to recognize at least Palestine as a state, because the next other option will be that Palestinians will rescind their claim for statehood. They will say, we no longer want a Palestinian state. We want a one democratic state with Israel, which would put it in a construction the same way as Belgium is. And that would be the absolute biggest nightmare of Israel, because it would lose its Jewish identity, on the one hand, if they allow it to be a democratic state. Otherwise, it will be an apartheid state. And that does not really bode well with the Israeli public nor the international community, as we have seen, for instance, in the case of South Africa. So the thing is, it is unclear what Israel's endgame is, and I doubt that they actually have one, in the sense that the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces military chief, or former military chief, he said that Palestine is Israel's Vietnam. Palestine, they're winning Israel's winning every battle against Palestine, but they're losing the war. The outcome of winning these battles is in fact a solution that they don't want to have. So, as for the end game, I think that Israel ideally would not recognize Palestine as an independent state. But I think that they will at least consider recognizing it if they would have some sort of control, some sort of limited measure of control, which is better than all the other opportunities or other solutions. And I think that a confederate body could provide Israel with precisely that. It could sway Israel to perhaps recognize Palestine for some additional benefits that they would not have under a two-state solution, or God forbid, under an apartheid state structure. So, and then the other part of that is how long is the international community gonna more or less keep this line going? How long are they gonna allow the occupation to continue? How long is it going to be before international pressure is going to be ramped up against Israel? And I think that with the recent developments of the last couple of weeks, if we look at the public opinion, if we look at the media reporting, if we look at the scrutiny that national leaders have been under for tweeting support for Israel or expressing support for Israel, shows that the clock is ticking for Israel to at least start thinking about their endgame, because the population or like the public opinion is swaying in Palestine's favor. More and more countries are becoming critical about Israel's policies. Even within the US, you have a substantial section of the Democratic Party that criticizes Israel, which has previously been unheard of. So, despite the fact that they probably never would want to recognize a Palestinian state, I think we're moving into the direction that they might, at one point in the future, be forced to do so. So there's the long answer.
But when we look at Israel's former foes, so to say, like in the Arab world, we see a multiplication of normalization of relations between Israel and some of the countries in the Arab world, such as Bahrain, Morocco, Egypt, Jordan, and also, for example, Saudi Arabia also recognized Israel's right to exist. So wouldn't that be under-country recognition of Israel's rights in their actual territory in Palestine, and on the contrary would make Palestine weaker in this sense?
Certainly, it was unwelcome news to the Palestinians. Although I would think that it would be very hard to maintain a line as a country nowadays that Israel no longer has the right to exist. I don't think that any country will openly say that. I think that in that sense, it's not surprising that it's happening. But I also think that these agreements are actually cosmetic. I don't think that they have any substantial, meaningful consequences apart from symbolic value. And for instance, you pointed out Bahrain. Bahrain had relations with Israel since the mid-2010s. So it's not a new development. The only thing is it's been officially recognized. So to what extent does that really change the situation if everybody knew about it and now you come out and say it? It's not a substantial change. Furthermore, Morocco, I think that it's very safe to say that they kind of didn't want to recognize Israel, but they got such an interesting package back for it that they just sort of did it. For instance, what news 2 days ago came out that the Israeli delegation towards Morocco was put on hold because they couldn't find hotels for them because the landlords would refuse to house Israeli diplomats. So to that extent, are these normalized relations? What's more is, have these countries been hostile to Israel? They have never fought a war with Israel. They've only rhetorically denounced Israel without much teeth behind it, and these countries have never really engaged in any military confrontation, and especially in the case of Sudan, which has had relations with Israel since somewhere in the 70s. So I would say that from a ideological standpoint, this hurts for the Palestinians, but in practice, I don't see any change in geopolitical spectrum. I don't see how this has affected the Middle East. And not to mention that the governments that have normalized their relationships with Israel have been actually put under a lot of pressure, but they have been suppressed by media, in the sense that there were demonstrations in the UAE, there were demonstrations in Bahrain. The thing is, we didn't hear about it because these countries heavily control the media and it just didn't come out. I would actually think, and I might be more of a minority in the Middle East research field, but I do actually think that it provides a window of opportunity for further peace talks. It created an atmosphere in Israel that there is peace possible with Arab populations, and I spoke to an Israeli rabbi like a while back, like 3 months ago or so, and he stated that there was genuinely an impression of that peace is possible among the Israeli population. So undoubtedly, this is very painful for the Palestinian leadership. But at the same time, I wouldn't read too much into it. I don't think it's as significant as the media said it was. I don't think it's as significant as Trump said it was. And it certainly wasn't as significant as Netanyahu said it was.
Okay, so one last question, and then we'll move on to the Q&A.
I think it's better to, because it's almost reaching 8, so maybe we give a chance the guests to have some questions, and of course maybe if we have time and if there's a lot of people left, of course we can still come back to the discussion. So anyone from the guests who has a question, please don't hesitate to raise your hand and unmute your mic or write the question in the chat.
Or those on YouTube, for that matter.
Of course, yeah, also YouTube. Check with yes, Emily.
Hello, everyone. I was wondering, I don't know if this is too relevant here, but regarding to the investigations being undertaken by the ICC at the moment regarding Israel, what are your thoughts on how this might turn out, especially with the kind of interference of the states often in this situation?
Well, thank you for that question. It kind of depends. I'm not going to speculate about what the outcome of the investigation is going to be, although I have my sincere doubts it's going to be anything else than a conviction. But what's interesting is that this is the first, I think, international law development on Palestine and Israel, which actually has a tangible effect. Previously, international law was invoked to substantiate primarily Palestinian claims for statehood or for territorial claims. But these have been relegated to sort of second or if not tertiary importance behind politics and international relations. The ICC, however, has a substantive real element to it in the sense that countries might arrest and send Israeli generals and policymakers to The Hague. But Hamas fighters, the same, by the way. They're equally under investigation. But the thing is, I think that what's interesting is I thought initially when I heard about this that Israel would sort of try to change its behavior when engaging in military fights. But we've seen in the recent round of fighting that it was completely the opposite, in the sense that they bombarded the Associated Press building where literally nobody except perhaps a handful of Israelis actually believed that there were Hamas fighters in there. So Israel is sort of, I think, in this topic for the ICC shooting itself in the foot, in the sense that they're continuing the previous line while under a very, very investigative lens in the ICC and in general in the world. And I think that if Israel would be condemned, it would be very difficult for a lot of countries, particularly in the EU, who have acceded to the ICC, to maintain a line where they support Israel. I think that it's a substantial development from before. Not enough to get Israel to the negotiating table, but it's one step towards forcing Israel to the negotiating table.
Thank you so much for your answer.
You're welcome.
Right. Someone else?
I might, in the meanwhile, also extrapolate a little bit on the question of enmity. Because while the ICC is a welcome development, I think that the Human Rights Watch report, which called Israel an apartheid state, was an actual bombshell. Human Rights Watch is traditionally a Jewish-funded and Jewish-established organization from New York, from one of the Jewish neighborhoods in New York. So they have a certain sense of credibility in that way. Israel denounced it as self-hating Jews, but that is a repeated cycle that they say about everybody who has criticism on Israel. But I think that the Human Rights Watch report, whether you agree with it or not, at least is a very, very useful tool for the Palestinians to petition to the entire world. Like, look, we're an apartheid state. How could you allow this? It's a very strong document, which kind of broke down the whole narrative that the conflict is complicated, that it's tit for tat, that you have two parties which are fighting each other, which we don't understand. It just quite clearly said you have one dominant party which oppresses what is now a majority of people in the region, and that constitutes apartheid. Done. It's not complicated. It's as simple as that. And I think that narrative is extremely important to work towards peace. And I think it is one of the reasons why the reporting on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict in the previous round of fighting was so incredibly different from previous times. I think that it really showed that the public opinion has been shifting and that media's stories got adapted. So I think that the Human Rights Watch report is a bombshell in that sense.
Yes, anyone has perhaps any comment on that?
Or counter suggestion?
I guess it was very convincing on your side, Omar.
Yeah, I guess that was clear enough. Let's keep it to that.
All right. So, any other questions from the guests?
I think otherwise. Oh, yeah.
You have one hand.
Actually, I have a comment to make, if I may. Actually, it's been a really stimulating session, honestly, and there's like a lot of information to process, at least for me. And I was just, sitting there and trying to comprehend and contemplate what the things that you said. So I couldn't really come up with a question, a relevant question, because you mostly touched upon all the areas, all the pertinent areas. So thank you so very much for taking the time. It was really, really insightful and stimulating. That's all I want to say.
Thank you very much for that. That's very appreciated. It's good to hear that there's a lot of relevant information in there. It's a very complicated topic to talk about, I think, especially from a neutral perspective. And I think that there are a lot of things which are important to take along when you talk about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict are actually forgotten or pushed to the side. Not to mention that there is a whole lot of narrative building in the sense of the demonization of Iran by Israel, the PR war between Hamas and Israel during rounds of fighting. And I completely understand if people get a little bit lost or taken aback by it. So I would like to thank you for your comments, that it clarified a lot to you, and then that you like the information presented.
Okay, and as a reminder, Omar Dweik, you are the author of the book Peace to Unity, which is not yet published, but will be this year. But Where can we find it?
It is actually recently published. 2 weeks ago, it came out commercially. It's now primarily available through the publisher's website. I will try to fetch you a link right now. And it will be available on Amazon soon as well. So let me just get the link to you. Although I'm not too sure if I can post it in the group. In the chat, I mean.
Well, if I may have this lulu.com where you can get it, is that it?
Yeah, that's the link where you can get it right now. Yeah. So if it's in the chat, then you can find it over there.
Yeah, I put it in the chat.
Okay, great. Thank you. What I also want to add is in the book, in one of the first pages, I publish an alternative email address through which you can always contact me. And for those who might want to write something about, write, for instance, an assignment or their thesis or any of the sort on topics which were addressed today, please feel free to contact me. I might be a little bit slow in emailing back, as David might have discovered, but I will get back to you, and I will be very happy to help you along with any of your works. Additionally, I strongly encourage anyone listening to this to read it and just give me feedback on their points of view, because I'm only one person, and I've overlooked undoubtedly some elements which might or might not be conform international law, and I'm very curious to hear what you guys think about it and have your criticism on it. So that said, I strongly encourage everyone to get a copy and to read it and come back to me.
All right. Perfect, and thanks for the details. I'm sure that there are many people who are quite interested and actually affected by this topic. So this is a great opportunity for them to actually delve deeper into this.
Yeah, and a last thing is, sorry, I just forgot to mention that some people in the Netherlands have had issues ordering from that website because it's UK based, and considering Brexit, everything needs to be complicated. But you can also just email me and I'll sort out a copy for you. In fact, at the moment, I have a limited amount of copies which are at a reduced price. So for those who are quick, they can get one for at least for €5 cheaper than the actual price. So for those who are interested, David, I don't know if you can share my email. This time my personal one would do.
Yes, I put the email on the chat so everyone can see it.
Perfect, yeah. So if you want to have a copy, please contact me and I'll sort that out for those who want a reduced price.
Perfect. Okay, so I'm going to give one more last opportunity to people if they have any questions about the book or the author, the writing process. Could be anything.
How I ended up in Belfast.
Personal life, yes, of course.
Personal life, yeah, exactly. Who my favorite teacher was.
Name of the first cat.
Name of the first cat, yeah. I think we can mostly call it at that. And if people have any further questions, again, my contact details are in the chat. Feel free to contact me if anything pops up and you'd like to know more about.
All right. Okay, then in that case, I will conclude this session. I'd like to take a moment to thank everyone for participating. I'll thank the ILSA Journal Committee for drafting up the questions, and of course the other committees for making this possible with advertising and everything else. It takes a while to plan this event, so kudos to the people who really put work into this. Thanks, Omar, today. Really appreciate it for the clarification that you gave. Of course, it's one thing to read the book And of course, it's another thing to actually have the author in front of you explaining what the book is actually about. So that's highly appreciated for the students. So yeah, on that note, of course, thank you to Jackie as well for participating in this discussion. And in case anyone has any last questions, or Omar, if you had any last remarks, then we can just call it a day.
Yeah, my last personal remarks are thank you very much to you for taking the time to organize this and take the lead on this, for ILSA to support it, and obviously to everybody in the audience, if I may call it that, for listening. Obviously, for anyone talking about his passion, having a group of people willing to listen to it is always a very welcome thing, and it was my great pleasure and my honor to be here and talk to you guys. Thanks
for joining us, Omar. I hope we'll see you in the future again, or if you publish it, or if you just pass by the Hague University, of course.
Yeah, it would be fun.
Just to visit the old place and everything. But yeah, in that case, I wish everyone a pleasant evening, and goodbye.
Bye. Thank you.